What if the most heavily guarded secret on Earth isn't hidden beneath the ocean or buried under the sands of Egypt, but frozen beneath a mountain that millions have stared at for centuries without ever understanding what truly lies inside? Tonight, we're going to climb that mountain together. And before we begin, if stories that blend forgotten history, ancient mysteries, and impossible discoveries fascinate you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Somewhere across the world, under another night sky, someone else is listening with you. Now, settle in. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine standing before a giant that has watched humanity for thousands of years. Mount Ararat rises from the eastern plains like something that does not belong to this world. Even from dozens of miles away, its snow-covered summit dominates the horizon with unnatural perfection. The twin peaks seem almost sculpted rather than formed by nature, as though someone carefully designed them to stand above every surrounding valley. For countless generations, travelers have looked upon that mountain and whispered the same question: what is it hiding? Officially, Ararat is just an extinct volcano located in eastern Turkey, standing more than 5,000 meters above sea level. Climbers visit its slopes every year with permits, guides, and strict military oversight. Governments describe the restrictions as necessary because of border security and regional instability. But stories have a strange habit of surviving where documents disappear. Some say shepherds have heard metallic echoes beneath the glaciers on windless nights. Others claim strange lights emerge from cracks in the ice before dawn and vanish before the first helicopters arrive. Entire expeditions have returned with missing equipment, confiscated cameras, and instructions never to discuss what they saw. The deeper you investigate, the stranger everything becomes. One of the most curious incidents allegedly occurred in the early 21st century, when a team reached high beneath the glacier and claimed to discover ancient wooden chambers locked inside the ice. Their announcement spread across international media almost instantly. They believed they had found evidence connected to Noah's Ark itself. Within days, military activity around the mountain reportedly intensified. Access became more difficult. Questions multiplied, answers disappeared. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it was simply politics. Or perhaps coincidence has become the safest explanation for things no one wishes to explain. The mystery of Ararat did not begin with modern explorers, long before satellites orbited overhead or drones surveyed frozen ridges. Ancient civilizations already regarded this mountain with unusual reverence. Armenian legends called it the sacred heart of creation. Biblical traditions connected it with humanity's survival after the Great Flood. Islamic scholars preserved stories of a holy resting place upon its slopes. Even older myths, nearly forgotten today, spoke of shining beings descending from the heavens to teach knowledge before vanishing back into the clouds. It is remarkable how cultures separated by language, geography, and centuries all pointed toward the same lonely summit. When historians compare legends, they usually expect contradictions. With Ararat, they find repetition. Again and again, different peoples described a place where heaven touched earth, a place where extraordinary visitors once walked among ordinary men. And that is where another mystery quietly enters the story. Because thousands of miles south, carved into clay tablets long before the Bible existed, the Sumerians recorded accounts of beings they called the Anunnaki. To many scholars, they were simply gods within mythology. To others, they represented symbolic forces of nature. But a growing number of researchers have wondered whether those ancient descriptions might preserve memories of something far more literal. What if the gods were travelers? What if mountains like Ararat were not chosen because they were sacred, but because they served another purpose entirely? As darkness settles over the frozen slopes and the wind sweeps across fields of ancient volcanic stone, it becomes easier to understand why so many stories refuse to die. The mountain does not reveal its secrets. It simply waits. And somewhere beneath layers of ice that have survived civilizations, empires, and religions, something may still be waiting too. Not for archaeologists, not for governments, but for the moment when humanity is finally ready to ask the right question. Long before the pyramids rose above the Egyptian sands, and long before the first kings carved their names into stone, people living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers told stories about a mountain that stood beyond ordinary geography. To them, it was not simply a place, it was a boundary, a meeting point between worlds. If you could travel backward 5,000 years and ask the oldest storytellers where the heavens touched the earth, many would not point toward a temple or a city. They would point north, toward a snow-covered summit that disappeared into the clouds. Mount Ararat occupied an unusual place in human memory. Civilizations that never shared borders somehow preserved remarkably similar traditions. They spoke of survivors climbing its slopes after catastrophe. They described divine beings descending from above. They warned that certain places near its summit were forbidden to ordinary men. When myths survive across cultures, historians usually search for a common source. Sometimes the source is trade, sometimes conquest, but occasionally the source may be a real event, remembered differently by generations separated by centuries. Imagine standing near the base of the mountain 4,000 years ago. The glaciers would have stretched farther than they do today. Forests would have covered lower valleys. Rivers born from melting snow would have fed settlements scattered across fertile plains. To ancient observers, Ararat would have seemed eternal, a pillar connecting heaven and earth. Perhaps that is exactly why so many religions later adopted it into their own traditions. The Book of Genesis speaks of Noah's Ark coming to rest upon the mountains of Ararat after the floodwaters receded. Centuries later, Armenian chroniclers described fragments of ancient timber hidden beneath permanent ice, insisting that no mortal could retrieve them because invisible forces protected the summit. Islamic traditions also preserve accounts of the Great Flood, while local Kurdish legends speak not of an ark, but of hidden chambers beneath the mountain where mysterious guardians sleep until the appointed time. Different languages, different beliefs, yet strangely familiar patterns. Even more curious is the mountain's geographical position. Ararat stands almost alone, dominating the surrounding landscape with such authority that it naturally attracts attention. Ancient caravans crossing the region could see its silhouette from enormous distances. Pilgrims used it as a landmark. Travelers wrote about it with admiration and fear. Some claimed compasses behaved strangely near certain slopes. Others described sudden weather changes impossible to predict. There are accounts of dense fog forming without warning, while neighboring valleys remained perfectly clear. Modern scientists would likely explain these events through local climate conditions and magnetic variations produced by volcanic rock. Yet folklore rarely settles for simple explanations. Instead, villagers passed down stories of invisible watchers. Old Armenian families once spoke quietly of lights moving across the summit after midnight. Not lightning, not stars, objects that glided silently above the glaciers before disappearing behind cliffs where no human settlement existed. Grandparents warned children never to climb too high, insisting the mountain belonged to older masters who tolerated visitors only for a little while. Then there were the caves. Natural lava tubes carved during ancient eruptions honeycomb parts of the volcano. Some remain unexplored even today because thick ice blocks their entrances. Local shepherds occasionally discovered openings after landslides, but often refused to investigate. They believed certain tunnels led downward far deeper than geology should allow. The oldest among them repeated an unsettling phrase: "The mountain is hollow." No one could explain exactly what that meant. Perhaps they referred to volcanic chambers, perhaps to folklore, or perhaps they were preserving fragments of knowledge whose original meaning had long been forgotten. By the 19th century, explorers arriving with maps and scientific instruments dismissed many of these stories as superstition. They measured elevations, collected rock samples, documented glaciers. And yet, even the most disciplined expeditions occasionally returned with reports that quietly contradicted expectations. Unexpected warm pockets beneath thick ice, echoes traveling from impossible directions, unidentified cavities detected below frozen surfaces. Nothing conclusive, nothing that could rewrite history, but enough to ensure the questions never truly disappeared. Then another puzzle emerged from much farther south. Thousands of clay tablets buried beneath Mesopotamian ruins began revealing translations that spoke of beings called the Anunnaki. At first glance, they appeared to be nothing more than gods from forgotten mythology. If we want to understand why Mount Ararat continues to attract speculation, we must leave the Bible behind for a moment and travel even further into the past, back to the first civilization that ever learned to write. Southern Mesopotamia, a landscape of rivers, marshes, and mud brick cities where priests pressed wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay nearly 6,000 years ago. Those tablets survived when kingdoms vanished, and on many of them appears a mysterious name: the Anunnaki. For generations, historians interpreted them simply as divine beings within Sumerian religion, the children of the sky god Anu, rulers of fate, judges of humanity. Nothing unusual for an ancient mythology. Yet mythology often carries fragments of memory disguised as symbolism. When translators looked more carefully, certain descriptions refused to fit comfortably into ordinary religious stories. The Anunnaki did not merely bless kings. They established order. They divided territories. They measured lands. They instructed people in engineering, irrigation, astronomy, and mathematics. Most remarkably, they were repeatedly described as descending from the heavens before ascending again. To ancient listeners, that language naturally became divine. But imagine explaining an airplane to someone living 5,000 years ago, or a satellite, or a spacecraft, The words would not exist. The only available vocabulary would be gods, chariots of fire, stars, and heaven. This possibility has fascinated alternative researchers for decades. Not because it proves extraterrestrial contact, it does not, but because it highlights how limited ancient descriptions can be when witnessing unfamiliar technology. Now consider another coincidence. The highest places on Earth have always been treated differently. Across continents, mountains became homes of gods. Olympus in Greece, Sinai in the Middle East, Kailash in Tibet, Fuji in Japan, and Ararat in Armenia. Why mountains? The religious explanation is simple. They are closer to heaven. But some researchers propose another interpretation. What if elevated locations served practical purposes? Higher ground provides visibility, isolation, protection, stable observation points. If an advanced civilization wished to monitor large regions, mountains would be ideal. Could this explain why the oldest legends repeatedly associate divine visitors with peaks that dominate entire landscapes? The idea sounds speculative, yet Ararat introduces another layer to the puzzle. Unlike many sacred mountains, it appears again and again, alongside stories of survival after catastrophe. Flood myths exist in cultures across the globe. The Sumerians preserved the epic of Ziusudra. The Babylonians told of Utnapishtim. The Hebrews wrote about Noah. The Greeks remembered Deucalion. Each account differs in detail, but all describe overwhelming waters, chosen survivors, and preserved knowledge. Perhaps they all descend from one historical disaster. Or perhaps they preserve memories of several events, compressed into a single narrative. What matters is what happens afterward. Again and again, civilization begins anew. Teachers appear. Agriculture returns. Cities are rebuilt. Knowledge re-emerges almost too quickly. It is almost as though someone already possessed the blueprint. This is precisely where the Anunnaki enter many modern theories. According to one interpretation, they were not conquerors, but custodians, observers who survived a catastrophe alongside small groups of humans and guided reconstruction afterward. In that framework, Ararat becomes more than the resting place of an ark. It becomes a refuge, a command center, a surviving outpost from before the flood itself. Of course, mainstream archaeology offers no evidence supporting such conclusions. No verified alien technology has ever been recovered. No authenticated inscription explicitly states that extraterrestrial beings built civilizations. Healthy skepticism remains essential. Yet questions continue to accumulate. Why do so many independent traditions connect advanced knowledge with visitors descending from the sky? Why do legends repeatedly describe shining beings teaching astronomy and engineering? Why do mountain sanctuaries appear across civilizations that never communicated with one another? And why does Ararat occupy such a central position within so many of these stories? Some of the oldest Armenian oral traditions describe hidden chambers beneath the summit where ancient wisdom sleeps until humanity becomes worthy of receiving it again. Interestingly, the legends never describe treasure. Not gold, not jewels, knowledge. They speak of rooms where the walls themselves preserve forgotten histories. Libraries carved into stone. Machines whose purpose no one remembers. voices that echo without speakers. It sounds like fantasy, until explorers begin reporting odd discoveries centuries later. An unusual geometric cavity beneath thick ice, metallic reflections impossible to reach, perfectly straight lines where only fractured volcanic rock should exist, satellite images showing shapes that seem almost deliberate before disappearing beneath fresh snowfall the following year. Individually, each report can be dismissed. Collectively, they create something harder to ignore. Imagine standing on the glacier at sunrise. The air is painfully thin. Every breath burns. Below your boots lies hundreds of feet of compressed ice that has not melted since before the Roman Empire. Beneath that ice could be nothing at all, or ancient timber, or volcanic tunnels, or the ruins of forgotten people, or perhaps something no historian has yet imagined. Because if the Anunnaki were ever more than mythology, they would not have left monuments in crowded cities. They would have chosen places almost impossible to reach, places where time itself becomes the perfect guardian, places exactly like Mount Ararat. For centuries, nearly every conversation about Mount Ararat has eventually led to one object: the Ark. It has become so deeply connected to the mountain that many people assume the two stories cannot exist separately. Mention Ararat, and someone will immediately imagine an enormous wooden vessel resting beneath ancient ice, preserved by impossible luck across thousands of years. But what if everyone has been looking for the wrong thing? Imagine approaching the mountain with no knowledge of Genesis, no flood, no Noah, no biblical expectations. What would you see? An isolated volcanic giant surrounded by legend, a place where unusual geological formations exist, a location repeatedly described as forbidden, a summit associated with strange lights, hidden chambers, and visitors from the sky. Would your first conclusion really be that an ancient wooden boat lies inside, or would you suspect something far older? The fascination with Noah's Ark began long before modern archaeology. Medieval monks climbed the lower slopes, believing fragments of sacred timber might still survive. Pilgrims collected ordinary wood from nearby valleys and claimed miraculous powers. Travelers returned with stories of enormous beams trapped in unreachable glaciers. Yet, despite hundreds of expeditions across centuries, no universally accepted evidence has ever emerged. Some researchers announced discoveries, others disproved them. Still others vanished into silence before publishing anything at all. One report would describe carved wooden walls. Another would insist they were natural rock formations. A third would reveal photographs that later disappeared. The mystery never ended. It simply evolved. There is another problem rarely discussed. Wood is fragile. Even in freezing conditions, glaciers move. Ice flows. Pressure crushes. Entire mountains slowly reshape themselves over thousands of years. If a wooden vessel had rested on Ararat since the end of the last great flood traditions, why would it remain intact after millennia of shifting ice? Many geologists believe such preservation would be extraordinarily unlikely. Unless the structure was protected, unless it existed inside a cavern, or unless it was never made primarily of wood at all. This is where alternative theories begin to diverge dramatically. Some researchers have suggested that ancient witnesses may have mistaken an enormous artificial structure for a ship, simply because they lacked better words. Picture an elongated building, half buried in snow. Viewed from a distance, its curved roof could resemble the hull of a vessel. Over centuries, oral tradition might transform a mysterious object into an ark, carrying life through catastrophe. Stories simplify. Memory reshapes itself. Symbols replace details. An even stranger possibility emerges from several forgotten Armenian legends. These tales describe not a floating ship, but a house above the waters. It was said to contain chambers, corridors, storage rooms, and places where knowledge survived while the world below drowned. Curiously, the descriptions sound less like a boat and more like a fortress or archive. Imagine for a moment that before some ancient catastrophe, whether flood or volcanic disaster, an advanced society chose the highest available ground to preserve its records. Instead of sailing across rising waters, they built upward, into stone, into the mountain itself. When later generations discovered fragments of the complex, they interpreted everything through the language they understood. The house above the waters became the Ark. The caretakers became Noah and his family. The archives became cages for animals, and practical survival transformed into sacred narrative. This does not prove anything, but it explains something remarkable. Many flood traditions emphasize preserving knowledge just as much as preserving life. Seeds, measurements, craftsmanship, astronomy, genealogies. The continuation of civilization mattered as much as survival itself. Now imagine another detail. Several satellite anomalies identified over the past decades show elongated shapes beneath glacial regions near Ararat's summit. Some researchers interpret them as natural rock. Others believe they resemble constructed geometry. Computer models cannot agree. The ice conceals too much. Ground exploration remains heavily restricted, so speculation grows where evidence cannot. Perhaps the greatest clue comes not from archaeology, but from psychology. Human beings rarely invent stories from nothing. Legends usually grow around real places, real people, real events. They exaggerate, distort, and mythologize, but somewhere beneath them often lies a seed of truth. The question is not whether Noah existed exactly as described. The question is why generation after generation insisted that the greatest refuge in history stood on this particular mountain. Why not another peak? Why not somewhere easier to reach? Why Ararat? Perhaps because people once saw something there, something so extraordinary that no explanation available to ancient minds could fully describe it. A structure emerging through clouds, metal reflecting sunlight, doors carved into impossible heights, machines mistaken for miracles. Or perhaps simply ruins so immense that they could only belong to beings remembered as gods. The Anunnaki fit naturally into such speculation. If they established centers from which they observed early humanity, isolation would have been essential. High mountains offered security impossible to achieve elsewhere. Snow concealed, distance protected. Only the determined could climb high enough to witness what remained. Even today, satellite photographs reveal scars across glaciers that appear and disappear with changing seasons. Some resemble collapsed entrances. Others suggest straight edges where nature rarely produces perfect lines. Every few years, new images ignite excitement before skeptics offer alternative explanations. The debate repeats endlessly, yet beneath every argument lies one uncomfortable fact. No one has fully explored what rests under Ararat's oldest ice. And until someone finally does, the arc may remain the wrong answer to the right mystery. Because perhaps humanity has spent 2,000 years searching for a ship, or standing unknowingly above an entire forgotten world. By the beginning of the 20th century, Mount Ararat had transformed from a place of legend into a destination for explorers armed with cameras, surveying equipment, and scientific confidence. Many believed that once modern technology reached the summit, centuries of speculation would finally come to an end. Instead, something unexpected happened. The technology improved. The mystery deepened. One of the earliest stories concerns a Russian military pilot flying reconnaissance missions during the First World War. According to accounts repeated for decades afterward, he reported seeing an enormous object embedded in the ice high on the mountain slopes. From above, it appeared unnaturally symmetrical, too large to be an ordinary outcrop, too regular to resemble random geology. Some versions claim photographs were taken. Others insist survey teams later climbed toward the location. Official documentation, however, has never been conclusively verified. The records either disappeared or were lost during the chaos that followed revolution and war. Whether the story is true or not, it established a pattern that would repeat over and over again. Someone sees something, an expedition is organized, excitement grows, then information vanishes. Decades later, satellite technology introduced a completely new perspective. For the first time in history, observers no longer needed to climb Ararat to examine it. They could study it from orbit. In the late 20th century, analysts reviewing high-resolution imagery noticed an elongated anomaly beneath a glacier near the summit. The shape measured roughly the size expected by many arc researchers and appeared surprisingly geometric. It quickly became known among enthusiasts as the Ararat anomaly. Interpretations varied wildly. Some believed it represented Noah's Ark. Others argued it was simply exposed bedrock distorted by lighting conditions. Digital enhancements seemed to support whichever conclusion the viewer already preferred. Yet what fascinated investigators most was not the image itself. It was what happened afterward. Subsequent photographs often appeared different. Snow coverage shifted. The outline became less distinct. Sometimes it vanished completely beneath fresh accumulation. Skeptics pointed out that glaciers constantly change. Believers suspected deliberate concealment. No consensus emerged. Then came the stories from climbers, not internet rumors written anonymously years later, but first-hand recollections shared quietly among mountaineering circles. Several described hearing deep vibrations beneath the ice, not avalanches, not thunder. A low, rhythmic resonance that seemed to travel upward through the ground itself. Others reported warm currents of air escaping from cracks where temperatures should have remained far below freezing. One experienced guide allegedly compared the sensation to standing above an underground engine. Most dismissed the feeling as geothermal activity. After all, Ararat is an ancient volcano. Residual heat beneath volcanic systems is not unusual. Yet another question naturally followed. If geothermal chambers explain everything, why do some thermal anomalies appear in perfectly straight lines extending beneath the glacier, rather than spreading randomly through volcanic rock? Satellite infrared imaging has occasionally revealed narrow, warm regions unlike surrounding terrain. Scientists generally attribute these to localized geological conditions. Alternative researchers suggest tunnels. Neither explanation has been conclusively proven. The restrictions surrounding Ararat only fuel speculation. Access requires permits. Military checkpoints monitor approaches. Certain sectors remain entirely off-limits depending on political circumstances and security concerns. Officials cite proximity to international borders and ongoing regional tensions. Those are legitimate reasons, but critics note that comparable mountains elsewhere receive far less attention. The mountain seems watched constantly. One retired climber recalled reaching a high camp just before dawn when he noticed helicopter lights moving silently across the western glacier. They hovered without landing. No rescue operation had been announced. No official expedition was scheduled. Within minutes, the lights disappeared behind the ridge. The following morning, military personnel reportedly questioned nearby teams about their exact movements during the night. Perhaps it was routine, perhaps coincidence again. Yet coincidence has become almost inseparable from Ararat. Stories circulate among local families of equipment confiscated after unexpected discoveries, cameras examined before being returned, GPS devices copied. Foreign researchers politely advised not to revisit certain locations. Most of these claims cannot be independently verified, but they persist because new witnesses continue adding similar details without apparent connection to previous accounts. Imagine hiking through endless white silence. The wind has stopped completely. Snow absorbs every sound. Then, beneath your boots, you feel a vibration. Not violent enough to frighten, just enough to suggest that somewhere below, hundreds of feet of ice, something massive still exists. Perhaps moving water, perhaps shifting rock, perhaps expanding volcanic gases, or perhaps chambers no map has ever recorded. This possibility becomes even more intriguing when modern ground-penetrating radar enters the discussion. Such instruments can detect hidden voids beneath glaciers and soil. Several surveys conducted around volcanic environments worldwide routinely reveal caves and lava tubes. Ararat almost certainly contains many of them. But what if some extend farther than expected? What if ancient people discovered those passages thousands of years ago? And what if they enlarged them? Imagine an underground sanctuary protected naturally by ice, inaccessible to invaders, preserved through centuries while kingdoms rose and fell below. Knowledge could survive there. Artifacts could survive there. Entire histories could survive there. The Anunnaki theories often place extraordinary emphasis on hidden repositories rather than visible monuments. If advanced beings, or simply advanced humans whose achievements have been forgotten, wished to preserve something through catastrophe, burying it beneath one of the world's most formidable mountains would make remarkable strategic sense. The deeper investigators look into Ararat, the less the mystery resembles a single lost ship. Instead, it begins to resemble an entire network of unanswered questions. Questions hidden beneath glaciers that move only inches each year. Questions that have outlived empires. Questions patient enough to wait another 1,000 years if necessary. And perhaps that patience is the mountain's greatest secret of all. If the legends are true, then the greatest secret of Mount Ararat is not resting on its slopes. It is hidden beneath them. Every mountain has caves. Every volcano has passages where lava once flowed before cooling into stone. Geologists know this well. Around the world, ancient volcanic systems contain tunnels stretching from miles, some large enough to swallow entire buildings. Ararat is no exception. Its violent geological past almost guarantees a labyrinth beneath the surface. But there is a difference between natural tunnels and tunnels that seem designed. Several decades ago, researchers using seismic measurements noticed something unusual beneath the mountain. Waves sent through the earth behaved differently in one particular region, almost as if they were passing through enormous empty spaces rather than solid volcanic rock. Normally, such readings suggest magma chambers or collapsed cavities, yet some analysts pointed out that the reflections appeared unusually regular, too organized, too symmetrical. Nothing was ever proven. The data remained incomplete. Still, it inspired a question that refuses to disappear. What if Ararat is hollow, in more ways than one? Imagine descending through a crack hidden beneath centuries of snow. At first, the walls are rough basalt formed by ancient eruptions. Then the passage widens. The floor becomes strangely level. The air grows warmer instead of colder. Moisture disappears. And after several hundred meters, the natural cave suddenly changes into something impossible. Perfect angles, smooth surfaces, stone blocks fitted so precisely that even a knife blade cannot slip between them. It sounds like fiction, yet similar transitions have been discovered elsewhere in the world. Beneath Egypt, below Turkey, inside Peru. Entire underground cities remained hidden until accidents revealed their entrances. The famous city of Derinkuyu in central Anatolia lay forgotten for centuries, despite housing thousands of people underground. If one underground metropolis could remain concealed until modern times, how many others still wait beneath mountains? Ancient Armenian folklore speaks repeatedly of chambers beneath Ararat, where the first wisdom sleeps. The phrase appears in different forms across generations. Not treasure, not kings, wisdom. Some versions describe halls lined with carved walls that emit their own faint light. Others mention endless staircases leading downward until travelers become lost forever. Parents frightened children with stories that anyone entering too deeply would return unable to recognize the surface world. Curiously, similar myths exist in Mesopotamian traditions connected with the Anunnaki. Certain texts refer to underground sanctuaries where divine beings retreated after periods of catastrophe. Whether these descriptions are symbolic or literal remains impossible to know. But the repetition is striking. If a civilization wished to preserve knowledge through global disaster, underground construction would make perfect sense. Floods cannot wash away sealed chambers carved into volcanic rock. Fire cannot easily penetrate hundreds of meters below ground. Time itself becomes an ally. Some modern engineers estimate that archives stored in stable underground conditions could survive for tens of thousands of years. Now imagine what might remain if such a repository had existed before recorded history. Maps of coastlines before rising seas, languages now forgotten, astronomical observations spanning millennia, technologies abandoned after catastrophe. Perhaps even records explaining who first taught humanity to farm, build cities, and watch the stars. This possibility gives new meaning to the Anunnaki legends. Perhaps they were not remembered because they ruled. Perhaps they were remembered because they preserved. The idea becomes even more intriguing when considering reports from climbers who claim to hear sounds beneath the ice. Several described rhythmic vibrations unlike earthquakes. One compared it to machinery operating somewhere far below. Another insisted the sound pulsed at regular intervals, almost like breathing. Geologists generally attribute such experiences to moving glaciers, hidden water channels, or shifting volcanic rock. These explanations are reasonable, yet none completely explains why similar descriptions have appeared across generations from witnesses unaware of each other's stories. Then there are the entrances. Every few years, photographs circulate showing dark openings exposed by melting snow. Some prove to be ordinary crevasses, others collapse before anyone investigates. A handful display surprisingly straight edges that fuel endless speculation online. By the following winter, they vanish again beneath fresh accumulation. The mountain hides itself with remarkable efficiency. Imagine that somewhere under those glaciers lies a corridor sealed thousands of years ago. No signs, no inscriptions, only ice slowly retreating as climates change. Each passing summer exposes a few more meters. Each winter buries them again. Time becomes a revolving door. The mountain reveals only what it chooses. Some researchers believe this gradual exposure may explain increased activity around Ararat in recent decades. As glaciers shrink, previously inaccessible regions become easier to monitor. Satellite companies photograph them. Independent climbers reach elevations once impossible. Governments naturally pay attention. Not necessarily because of ancient aliens, not necessarily because of Noah, but because hidden archaeological discoveries of any kind carry enormous historical and political consequences. Still, the imagination wanders. Suppose the tunnels are real. Suppose they extend kilometers beneath the volcano. Suppose at their center lies a chamber untouched since before recorded history. Would we recognize what we found? Or would we interpret everything through modern assumptions, just as ancient people interpreted unfamiliar wonders as acts of gods? Perhaps polished metal would become sacred stone. Perhaps electrical light would become divine fire. Perhaps preserved machinery would become miraculous relics. History has a habit of translating the unknown into the language of belief. The Anunnaki themselves may be an example of exactly that process. Not literal gods, not necessarily extraterrestrials, but visitors or survivors whose knowledge exceeded that of those who remembered them. And if they truly wished to leave something behind for future generations, they would have hidden it where armies could never reach, where empires could never burn it, where centuries would become guardians instead of destroyers. Deep beneath a mountain that already commanded reverence, deep beneath Mount Ararat, waiting patiently until curiosity finally became stronger than fear. If hidden tunnels beneath Mount Ararat remain only a theory, then another mystery is even more difficult to explain. The symbols, again and again, scattered across decades of testimony, Witnesses describe markings unlike anything they expected to find in the ice. Not random scratches, not natural fractures. Symbols. No two accounts are identical, yet they share curious similarities. Straight lines intersecting impossible curves, repeating geometric patterns, characters that seem almost mathematical rather than artistic. Some compare them to cuneiform. Others insist they resemble no known writing system at all. The remarkable part is that many people describing these markings had no connection to one another. Imagine lowering yourself through a narrow crevasse opened by melting summer ice. The rope creaks softly. Blue light surrounds you as sunlight filters through layers of ancient glacier. At the bottom, your flashlight catches something reflecting beneath frost. You brush away frozen crystals. The surface beneath is smooth, not polished rock, not ice. Something harder. Embedded across it are shallow grooves arranged in repeating order. At first glance, they seem decorative. Then you realize they are organized, intentional. Language, perhaps, or instructions. It is impossible not to wonder who carved them. Modern climbers? Impossible at such depth. Ancient pilgrims? Unlikely. Natural erosion? Highly doubtful. Stories resembling this scenario have circulated for years among mountaineering communities. Most remain anecdotal. Some were never documented publicly. A few surfaced briefly online before disappearing without explanation. Whether true or exaggerated hardly matters anymore. The idea itself has taken root. Because humanity has encountered forgotten writing before. When archaeologists uncovered Egyptian hieroglyphs, no one alive could read them. When Linear B tablets emerged from Greece, scholars stared at meaningless symbols for decades before finally deciphering them. The same happened with cuneiform. Entire civilizations spoke silently until someone discovered the key. What if another script still waits beneath Ararat? Perhaps older than Sumer, older than Akkad, older even than the first cities. The Anunnaki hypothesis often centers on knowledge transferred to humanity. According to certain interpretations, they introduced astronomy precise enough to predict planetary movements, mathematics sophisticated enough to design monumental architecture, and calendars astonishingly accurate for their age. Whether one accepts those claims or not, Mesopotamian civilization undeniably possessed advanced understanding remarkably early in history. The question has always been where that knowledge came from. Human ingenuity is the obvious answer. Yet ancient people themselves frequently attributed it to teachers descending from above. If those teachers existed, even as exceptional humans later mythologized into gods, they may have written differently than those who followed. Suppose fragments of that writing still survive. Suppose archaeologists eventually uncover walls covered with inscriptions no known linguistic family can explain. The discovery would transform not merely archaeology, but humanity's understanding of its own origins. Some alternative historians believe exactly this has already happened in secret. They speculate that unusual inscriptions recovered from inaccessible sites remain classified because they refuse to fit accepted timelines. There is no verified evidence supporting such claims, but secrecy breeds imagination, and Ararat offers fertile ground for both. Local folklore adds another layer. Older villagers once told stories about stones that sang, not literally through music, but through vibration. Touch certain carved surfaces, they claimed, and low tones would resonate through the mountain itself. Modern acoustics demonstrates that carefully shaped chambers can amplify sound dramatically. Ancient temples often exploited this principle. What earlier generations interpreted as supernatural voices sometimes proved to be brilliant engineering. Could hidden halls beneath Ararat produce similar effects? Imagine a corridor designed thousands of years ago, where every whisper travels impossible distances, where footsteps echo from invisible chambers, where language itself seems alive. A frightened traveler emerging from such a place might easily describe hearing the mountains speak. Then there are the reports involving metallic walls. Several climbers over the last century privately described seeing surfaces beneath ice that reflected light unnaturally. Not silver, not gold, something darker, smooth enough to resemble worked metal despite existing where no metal should naturally appear. Skeptics suggest volcanic glass or unusual mineral deposits. That explanation may well be correct. Nature often creates astonishing illusions. Yet, imagination asks another question. What if the reflective material forms part of something constructed? A door, a ceiling, a machine. The thought becomes strangely compelling when paired with ancient traditions describing the Anunnaki as builders rather than magicians. Builders leave structures, structures leave materials, materials leave traces, even after civilizations disappear. Some linguists have noticed fascinating parallels between myths separated by thousands of miles. In several cultures, sacred mountains are described not only as homes of gods, but as libraries, places where the first words were kept. The concept appears among peoples who never met one another. Perhaps language itself was considered divine because writing changed civilization forever. Or perhaps memory preserved an actual location where knowledge had once been stored. Imagine walls stretching for hundreds of meters beneath volcanic stone, every surface engraved. Maps, star charts, mathematics, histories, warnings, instructions intended for descendants who would one day rediscover them. If such a repository existed, its greatest challenge would not be surviving time, it would be surviving interpretation. Future discoverers might mistake engineering for religion, science for myth, history for fantasy, exactly as humanity has done many times before. The strangest possibility is also the simplest. Perhaps the symbols no one can read are not impossible because they belong to aliens. Perhaps they are impossible because they belong to humans so ancient that every language descended from theirs has vanished. A civilization erased so completely that only mountains remember it. And somewhere beneath Ararat's frozen silence, beneath pressure that has accumulated for thousands of winters, those forgotten words may still wait patiently on walls no sunlight has touched since before history began. Waiting for someone not merely to find them, but to understand what they were trying to say. If there is nothing unusual hidden beneath Mount Ararat, then one question becomes difficult to answer. Why does the mountain inspire such extraordinary caution? Every nation protects certain places, military bases, border zones, strategic infrastructure. No reasonable observer would expect unrestricted access to sensitive regions. Yet Ararat occupies a peculiar position where security, archaeology, religion, and mythology overlap so completely that separating one from another becomes almost impossible. Imagine discovering the greatest archaeological site in human history. Not merely another temple or forgotten palace, but evidence that rewrites the origin of civilization itself. How would governments react? Would they announce everything immediately? Would every photograph be released the same day? History suggests otherwise. The Dead Sea Scrolls remained under restricted scholarly control for decades. Fragments of ancient manuscripts often spend years in laboratories before publication. Governments regularly classify discoveries connected to national heritage until proper analysis is complete. Now imagine something even larger. Suppose excavators uncovered undeniable proof that humanity's timeline was incomplete. A structure 10,000 years older than expected, a library predating known writing, technology impossible to explain using accepted chronology. The consequences would extend far beyond archaeology. Religious traditions would face new questions. Educational systems would require revision. Entire fields of history would need rewriting. Political disputes over ownership would erupt overnight. Millions of pilgrims would descend upon the site. Media attention would become uncontrollable. Perhaps secrecy would not begin as conspiracy. Perhaps it would begin as caution. This possibility often gets overlooked. The simplest explanation is not always sinister. Sometimes people hide discoveries because they themselves do not understand them. Nevertheless, rumors surrounding Ararat continue to multiply. Some describe helicopters transporting unidentified cargo beneath heavy coverings. Others mention scientific teams arriving quietly under military escort. A few claim construction has taken place far above elevations where permanent facilities would seem practical. Verification remains elusive. Satellite imagery shows roads where roads did not previously exist. Whether they support ordinary security operations or something more ambitious remains uncertain. But uncertainty is fertile ground for imagination. The Anunnaki theory introduces another possibility. Suppose researchers uncovered artifacts suggesting contact between prehistoric humans and a previously unknown civilization. Even without extraterrestrial implications, such evidence would become one of the most important discoveries in history. Every nation would seek influence. Every museum would compete for access. Every religion would attempt interpretation. Control would become priceless. History demonstrates repeatedly that information equals power. Ancient maps have altered territorial claims. Forgotten manuscripts have changed theological debates. One buried city can reshape national identity. How much more disruptive would an entire hidden complex beneath Ararat become? Then there is economics. Tourism alone would explode. International funding would pour into excavation projects. Ownership disputes could last generations. Neighboring countries might advance competing historical narratives based on newly uncovered evidence. What begins as archaeology quickly becomes geopolitics. Some analysts therefore argue that strict regulation around Ararat reflects exactly these concerns. Nothing mysterious, simply preparation for potential cultural conflict. Yet another thought quietly lingers. What if authorities fear not what has been found, but what might still be found? Imagine conducting exploratory drilling beneath ancient ice. Your instruments reveal large, artificial voids. No one knows whether entering them could destabilize glaciers, or release trapped gases, or damage priceless historical remains. Closing access until proper planning would be entirely reasonable. Now consider how such practical caution appears to outsiders. From a distance, it resembles secrecy. Silence invites speculation. Speculation creates legends. Legends attract more curiosity. The cycle feeds itself. Still, several aspects remain difficult to dismiss. Throughout history, certain researchers who publicly pursued Ararat's mysteries described abrupt interruptions, permits delayed indefinitely, funding withdrawn, projects quietly abandoned. Official explanations usually cited administrative issues or changing priorities. Perhaps that is all they were. Research fails every day for ordinary reasons. Yet when repeated against the backdrop of centuries-old myths, ordinary events begin to appear extraordinary. The human mind naturally searches for patterns. Sometimes it finds them where none exist. Sometimes it overlooks them until too late. The mountain itself offers no clarification. Snow covers every season equally. It hides military tracks as easily as ancient ruins. It buries mistakes alongside miracles. That silence has transformed Ararat into a mirror. People see within it whatever they already believe. Believers see Noah. Alternative historians see the Anunnaki. Scientists see geology. Governments see strategic terrain. Pilgrims see holiness. Explorers see unanswered questions. Perhaps the mountain has become famous not because of what lies inside it, but because it reflects humanity's deepest desire to discover where we truly came from. And yet, there remains one possibility stranger than all the others. What if every explanation contains only part of the truth? What if Noah's tradition preserved memories of survival? What if Armenian legends preserved memories of hidden chambers? What if Mesopotamian texts preserved memories of extraordinary teachers? What if geological anomalies preserved evidence of natural tunnels? And what if, layered together across thousands of years, these fragments accidentally describe the same forgotten place from entirely different perspectives? History often survives not in complete books, but in scattered sentences. A priest remembers one detail, a shepherd remembers another, an empire records a third. Centuries later, no single witness remains, only overlapping echoes. Mount Ararat may be exactly that, an echo so ancient that every civilization heard it differently. Perhaps beneath the glaciers there is no alien machine, no impossible technology, no supernatural gateway. Perhaps there is only evidence that humanity once knew far more than it remembers today. And sometimes forgotten knowledge can be more dangerous than any weapon. Because once a civilization learns that its history began differently than it believed, every certainty built upon that history begins to shift. The mountain has remained silent through kingdoms, crusades, revolutions, and wars. It watched languages disappear. It watched religions rise. it watched borders change, and through all of it, whatever lies beneath the ice has never once felt the need to explain itself. It simply waits, knowing that curiosity, sooner or later, always climbs higher than fear. The oldest stories in the world rarely begin with human beings. They begin with someone arriving. Again and again, across continents separated by oceans and millennia, ancient cultures describe mysterious figures descending from the heavens to teach, to judge, or to rebuild after catastrophe. The names change, the clothing changes, the languages change. Yet the pattern remains remarkably familiar. In Mesopotamia, they were remembered as the Anunnaki. In other lands, they became shining messengers, culture heroes, celestial kings, or divine architects. Perhaps they were nothing more than mythology. Perhaps they represented natural forces given human form. But imagine, just for a moment, that every civilization was attempting to describe the same forgotten encounter using its own vocabulary. Then Mount Ararat begins to look different. It no longer appears as a lonely volcano crowned with snow. It becomes a meeting place, a landmark remembered not because of its height, but because something happened there that generations refused to forget. One curious feature of ancient myths often goes unnoticed. The teachers almost always arrive after destruction. Floods, fire, darkness, great storms, collapsed civilizations. Then, almost immediately, knowledge returns. Agriculture, writing, astronomy, architecture, metalworking, as though someone had preserved the instruction manual while everything else disappeared. Modern archaeology has repeatedly discovered examples where technological progress seems astonishingly rapid. Within surprisingly short periods, societies mastered engineering that still impresses observers today. Of course, humans are extraordinarily inventive. No supernatural explanation is required. Yet ancient people themselves rarely claimed credit. Instead, they insisted someone showed them. The Sumerians wrote of beings who measured the heavens. The Egyptians spoke of divine founders. The Maya connected their calendars to visitors from beyond ordinary understanding. Even isolated traditions in distant regions preserve memories of wise strangers arriving unexpectedly. Coincidence? Shared psychology? Independent invention? Or fragments of a story too old for certainty? Imagine a handful of survivors after a global catastrophe. Their cities destroyed, libraries lost, most practical knowledge erased. Now imagine another small group escaped with preserved records. Compared to everyone else, they would appear almost magical. They could predict eclipses, construct irrigation, calculate seasons, navigate by stars. To frighten survivors rebuilding from nothing, such people would naturally become gods. Perhaps this is all the Anunnaki ever were. Not extraterrestrials, not immortals, simply the last guardians of an older civilization. Generation after generation exaggerated their abilities until memory transformed engineers into deities. Yet another possibility remains. Suppose they truly came from elsewhere, not necessarily another planet, perhaps another continent now submerged, perhaps another culture isolated beyond ordinary contact. History repeatedly demonstrates how quickly technological differences create myths. When European explorers first reached certain remote societies, firearms appeared supernatural. Steel seemed miraculous. Ships looked impossible. Within only a few generations, factual encounters evolved into legend. Scale that process across thousands of years, and almost anything becomes possible. This perspective casts Ararat in a fascinating role. If advanced survivors sought refuge after catastrophe, they would likely choose locations naturally protected from flooding and invasion. High mountains, difficult terrain, reliable fresh water, isolation. Ararat satisfies every condition. Even more intriguing is its visibility. From surrounding plains, the mountain dominates the horizon. It becomes an unmistakable beacon. Anyone searching for guidance after disaster would instinctively move toward it. Perhaps this explains why so many traditions converge there, not because everyone remembered identical events, but because everyone remembered traveling toward the same landmark. Some speculative researchers suggest the glaciers themselves preserve clues. Ice forms in annual layers, much like tree rings. Deep cores extracted elsewhere reveal atmospheric history stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Imagine drilling beneath Ararat and discovering unexpected materials trapped between ancient ice. Worked stone, metal fragments, organic remains from an unknown culture. The implications would be extraordinary. Perhaps future technology will eventually allow such exploration without damaging the site. Until then, imagination continues filling the gaps left by evidence. The stories of local shepherds become especially interesting in this context. Several old traditions describe tall strangers appearing after violent storms. They wore bright clothing, spoke unfamiliar languages, accepted no gifts, then vanished toward the upper slopes. The tales are impossible to verify. They may simply reflect folklore passed through generations. Yet similar motifs exist in many mountain cultures worldwide. Visitors who descend briefly before disappearing again, the mountain becomes a doorway rather than merely a destination. Then there is the sky itself. Ancient observers watched stars with astonishing dedication. Many sacred mountains align with important celestial events. Certain peaks frame solstices, others mark seasonal transitions. Ararat's immense silhouette would have served as a natural astronomical reference, visible across enormous distances. Perhaps priests climbed its lower slopes, not to worship the mountain, but to observe the heavens from it. If the Anunnaki stories preserve memories of exceptional astronomers, the connection becomes even more understandable. Knowledge of the sky meant survival, planting seasons, navigation, calendars, kingship. Civilization itself depended on accurate observation. The teacher who mastered the stars mastered the future. As night settles over the snowfields, it becomes easier to imagine why generations stared upward, searching for answers. The summit disappears into darkness. Clouds drift silently across frozen cliffs. Somewhere beneath those glaciers may lie nothing more than volcanic stone, or perhaps abandoned tunnels, or forgotten archives, or traces of people whose achievements became legends after memory failed. The Anunnaki may never have descended from distant worlds. They may instead represent humanity's own forgotten ancestors, elevated into myth because later generations could no longer comprehend what they accomplished. And if that is true, the greatest mystery of Mount Ararat is not whether aliens once visited Earth. It is whether human history is vastly older, deeper, and more extraordinary than anyone has yet dared to imagine. For sometimes, the line between gods and forgotten people is thinner than the snow that covers a mountain. And once that line disappears, the entire past begins to look different. As dawn approaches over Mount Ararat, the first light does not reveal its secrets. It only makes the silence more visible. The glaciers glow faintly beneath the rising sun, covering every ridge in pale gold. From the valleys below, nothing seems unusual. Shepherds begin leading their flocks across familiar paths. Birds circle the lower slopes. The wind carries the scent of stone and melting snow. The mountain appears exactly as it has for thousands of years, unchanging, patient, watching. Perhaps that is why it has become such a powerful symbol. Every civilization that encountered Ararat projected its greatest hopes and deepest fears onto its summit. Survivors imagined salvation. Priests imagined heaven. Explorers imagined discovery. Scientists imagined answers. Dreamers imagined impossible machines buried beneath the ice. And through every generation, the mountain refused to confirm or deny any of it. That silence may be its greatest lesson. Modern humanity often believes that every mystery will eventually surrender to technology. We launch satellites, we drill through glaciers, we scan the Earth with radar, we map entire continents from orbit. Yet despite all these achievements, enormous portions of our own history remain uncertain. The oldest chapters are still missing. Somewhere between myth and archaeology lies a gap no textbook can fully explain. Who built the earliest monuments? How did knowledge spread so rapidly across distant civilizations? Why do flood traditions appear on nearly every continent? Why do cultures separated by oceans preserve stories of teachers arriving after catastrophe? There may be ordinary answers to every one of these questions. Human intelligence alone is capable of astonishing achievements. Independent invention happens. Stories evolve naturally. Legends borrow from one another. The simplest explanation often proves correct. And yet, sometimes the simplest explanation is that we have simply not found enough evidence yet. History is not fixed. Every decade rewrites something. Göbekli Tepe forced archaeologists to reconsider when organized societies began constructing monumental architecture. Ancient DNA transformed assumptions about migration. Lost cities emerge from jungles using laser mapping technology. Shipwrecks appear beneath receding coastlines. Civilizations once dismissed as legend become reality through patient excavation. If so much has changed already, who can confidently say what future discoveries beneath mountains like Ararat might reveal? Imagine archaeologists 100 years from now. New instruments penetrate kilometers of ice without drilling. Artificial intelligence reconstructs collapsed chambers from faint seismic echoes. Tiny autonomous machines crawl through microscopic fractures and transmit images from spaces no human can enter. Perhaps one day they reach an underground hall. Their cameras illuminate walls untouched for ages, rows of inscriptions, maps carved into stone, mechanical objects preserved by cold, or perhaps only natural caves filled with volcanic rock. Either outcome would finally replace speculation with certainty. Until then, the mystery remains alive precisely because it cannot yet be settled. The Anunnaki occupy a similar place. Whether they were literal beings, symbolic gods, exceptional humans, or misunderstood memories, hardly matters as much as what they represent. They embody humanity's oldest question: who came before us? Every generation asks it differently. Children ask where people came from. Historians ask where civilization began. Astronomers ask whether intelligence exists elsewhere in the universe. Philosophers ask whether memory can outlive time. The Anunnaki are simply one answer among many. Perhaps they never existed. Perhaps they existed so long ago that every surviving description became mythology. Perhaps they are waiting only in stories because stories were the strongest containers ancient people possessed. And stories, unlike stone, can survive without ever being excavated. As evening returns to the mountain, clouds gather once more around its summit. The highest ridges disappear behind drifting mist. It becomes impossible to distinguish where snow ends and sky begins. Somewhere beneath those frozen layers may rest nothing but basalt shaped by ancient eruptions, or forgotten tunnels, or abandoned sanctuaries, or the remains of a civilization whose memory fractured into religion, legend, and folklore. No explorer today can say with certainty. No satellite can see through every meter of ice. No historian possesses every missing page. Perhaps that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the story alive. Because mysteries invite imagination, and imagination drives discovery. If humanity ever stops asking impossible questions, it will stop uncovering impossible truths. So the next time you see a photograph of Mount Ararat rising above the clouds, remember that you are not merely looking at a mountain. You are looking at one of the oldest unanswered questions on Earth. A monument built by nature, but claimed by every civilization that ever saw it. A place where history and myth have become so tightly intertwined that separating them may no longer be possible. Maybe Noah stood there. Maybe forgotten engineers stood there. Maybe survivors carrying the last knowledge of a vanished age watched the floodwaters recede from its slopes. Or maybe generations of storytellers simply chose the most magnificent peak they could imagine and filled it with meaning. The truth may be simpler than the legends, or far stranger. The glaciers will continue to move. The snow will continue to fall. The winds will erase footprints almost as soon as they appear. Empires will rise and disappear, just as countless others already have. And through it all, Mount Ararat will remain exactly where it has always been, keeping whatever answer it holds beneath layers of ice older than memory itself. Patient enough to wait another century, patient enough to wait another 1,000 years, knowing that eventually someone will climb high enough, dig deep enough, and ask the one question that finally unlocks the silence. Until that day comes, the Forbidden Mountain will continue doing what it has always done best, watching humanity search for itself. Yet the more scholars translated, the stranger the descriptions became. These figures did not simply create miracles. They built, they measured, they descended from the heavens. They instructed humanity in agriculture, mathematics, architecture, and kingship. And according to several interpretations, they established elevated places from which they observed the world below. Mountains, always mountains. If that symbolism reflected something real rather than poetic imagination, then perhaps Ararat was never sacred because Noah landed there. Perhaps Noah's story survived because the mountain had already been sacred for thousands of years before anyone ever wrote about the flood. And somewhere, beneath snow that has buried generations of forgotten footsteps, the oldest chapter may still remain unread.